I feel like a misfit. I'm an alien. I feel like a professional actress. These were all things that I said while I was younger before I discovered that I was autistic and ADHD. This is Reader Reflections. My name is Kendall, late diagnosed autistic ADHD are here. And in this video, I just want to talk a little bit about the concept of masking. I think it's a term that's gained a lot of traction in the last couple of years through social media mainly. And I think it's a good thing. Um, I think it's important to note too that to some extent, even, neurotypical people or, non-autistic, non-ADHD people can do this also. And masking is, in terms of, autism and ADHD, it's essentially consciously or unconsciously suppressing those traits. So, this can be everything from, maybe suppressing, uncomfortable sensory issues if you're out in public, forcing eye contact, engaging in small talk that's uncomfortable or you're not interested in. With more of the ADHD side too, it can be just trying to pass as being more organized and more put together and not really showing the chronic overwhelm that you're experiencing. But I think that if we just look at, the textbook definition of masking, okay, you're just suppressing these traits. Well, I don't think that people can really understand the severity of it from that, because when I look back, masking has impacted my life a lot. And I think, to be honest, there are probably always going to be settings where to some extent we do have to mask. And I think that it's important to point out there is a difference, in my opinion, between learning certain social skills or, certain skills to manage, your ADHD and things like that. There's a difference between that and actual masking, in my opinion. Masking, I think, it's not, a lack of skill with a certain thing, but it's actually just suppressing like your true instincts, and it can actually, result in suppressing your needs too. So you might get, short-term gratification socially, which is the main reason that we do this. But it's not just social settings that we have to do it. It's also work environments also. And I think for me, when I reflect back on the ways that masking has really impacted me and the major ways that I have masked throughout my life, it's easier for me to kind of think about it chronologically and kind of like the first, I guess, masks, if you will, that I kind of adopted. I do think it's worth noting that there's definitely going to be more masking if you're a late diagnosed, autistic or ADHDer. I do think that, women or assigned female at birth people, they may have like more social pressure to mask at times. And I do think that there's like a lot of, discussion around topics of like pretty privilege and things like that, because I think that it can really impact masking. And for myself, I almost felt like I was kind of forced into certain types of masks or social groups based on the way that I looked, or it was just easier to kind of morph into that. But back to kind of like how I think about it chronologically, I would say one of the first ways I was taught to mask was just making eye contact. And I learned at a young age, I was taught. And of course, the adults in my life, I look back with, empathy for them, because they didn't have any idea I was autistic, really. We figured out I was ADHD when I was about 15 or 16. But, to the outside world, I was just this exuberant, quirky, mystical, imaginative, hyperverbal child. But I can remember being told, you look like you're not paying attention to someone, like you don't care, or you can even come across as distrustful. So I learned at a very young age to make eye contact. And if you're neurodivergent, we have some tricks for the whole eye contact thing. I'm really good at noticing, I will say I notice a lot. If you need to go see a dermatologist or something, I will know, because I will find a little mole or something on your face to focus on, so I can kind of dissociate from it and then make prolonged eye contact. That's another thing though too, is sometimes when you learn to mask really well, you pretty much learn just to make really intense eye contact. And I think that for autistic women, especially, a lot of the stems that we take on or the way that we mask our eye contact comes across as flirtation. That's something that I've had to learn the hard way in my life. But anyways, I would say that the eye contact was one of the first things that I can really remember. But I can remember being 3 years old and saying like, "Mom, I'm a misfit. Like I'm from another planet. Like I am not like the other children." And it was just there was just really clear social differences for me, even with the ways that I played. I really didn't enjoy playing with other kids that much. I I really, when I was at home, it was more like I was one of those I would set up kind of stuff, like play scenes, and then I had my special interests. Like I had like one really close friend throughout grade school. She had similar interests that I did with animals, and I can remember her and I like creating bug collections and stuff on the playground. But anyways, before I go off on story tangents, I would actually mask by like trying to seem interested and trying to seem engaged, like I was having fun with other kids. But I can remember like not enjoying that and just standing there like awkwardly, like wanting to be included, but just not really knowing how to interact, but trying to do the right things, I guess. And then around that same time was just, my sensory issues became really evident. I actually had a really hard time with clothing, and I just learned to, kind of keep quiet about stuff. And I would speak up if it, like, as a child, if it was really, really terrible. But as you get older, like you get less, if you're not diagnosed, as you get older, you get less and less, I guess, leeway, if you will, for, freaking out over like the way a tag feels. And at that age, as I got older, I really wasn't able to know that it was necessarily sensory issues that was bothering me. But I think masking or suppressing sensory issues is a big way that we do this masking or camouflaging. And I think that it's so prevalent in late diagnosed people because we already have kind of like this imposter syndrome that we're battling with. And I think the last thing we want to do is feel like we're, an inconvenience to others by needing accommodations or things like that. And I just kind of learned ways to get around with it, to get around it the best that I could. I, would look for excuses to take breaks outside or take a restroom break when I felt overstimulated. And a lot of my stems are ones that are socially acceptable and not seen as stems, or they're hidden. I have a lot of stems I do with my toes. You can't see, obviously, or, inside of the pocket of my jacket. For me, jewelry, hair, all of that. But again, that goes back into the, a lot of the stems that late diagnosed women have. They're, seen as flirtation if you're sitting there like, chewing gum or twirling with your hair all day while someone's like talking to you. That can easily be misconstrued as flirtation sometimes. Those were the major ways that I think I kind of suppressed my autistic traits. And then especially I think around like middle school, grade school, when I was really struggling more academically with ADHD issues, also just with chronic overwhelm, just with, wanting to hide the embarrassment of losing things or pretending like I was listening to what somebody was saying. And I think that, when you name the stuff off, yeah, it may not seem like it's going to really impact you, but you get older in life and you get to like social situations where they can really impact you. And I look back and I think when you pair masking with delayed processing, there can be some really devastating results sometimes. I look back in situations and, as I got older, one way that I masked my autistic and ADHD traits is because of that, I can have black and white thinking on topics that I'm very passionate about. But a lot of that is just, I also have a strong sense of justice, and that's a very common autistic trait. I've always felt compelled to kind of, stand up for the underdog, and I am very just like passionate about my spirituality and just trying to live like a really healthy, high vibrational life that's, an inspiration for others. But like I can look back and there have been so many times where I was chastised for like voicing my opinions. And just I think that masking for so long kind of turned me into like more of a docile version of myself. And I found myself in some really tricky situations later on as an adult, which maybe when I'm feeling more comfortable, I'll share those in depth, but I can look back and I was masking like my true feelings about situations. I was uncomfortable with things. It didn't feel right. I wanted to ask more questions. But because I'd been, scolded for that so many times, I'd gotten so many negative repercussions, there were a lot of situations that I just went along with, that I just kind of let myself fade into the background as much as I could and just kind of went with it. And I think that's one way that, masking can really impact us that maybe we don't talk about quite as much. But for me, that's had the most devastating impacts on my life, because I can look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, I was masking everything in that situation. I was masking how physically uncomfortable I was. I was masking how I felt emotionally. And I think that when you talk about the long-term harms of masking, what you get into is you get into a lot of identity issues, like who am I actually? But then beyond that, you deal with a lot of burnout. I mean, it's exhausting, like all of the extra mental effort that has to go into basically regurgitating a totally different response for everything other than what your brain is naturally giving you. It's like having to go through two different processing systems for everything that takes everyone else one processing system. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, but it's like I have like, okay, my brain's response, okay, put it back to the masked response so that it's socially acceptable. And it takes a lot of brain power, like, make eye contact, walk in a straight line. Like, it's a lot. And when you're in situations or social settings or workplaces where you have to mask that much, it can really lead to bad burnout. And I don't know that I've found a job necessarily where you don't have to mask to some extent. I think that's part of most workplaces, but there's definitely been some where I've had to mask way more than others, and it was just too much for me. Interestingly enough, in more of a professional sense, like if you're, just customer to customer, or I mean, like, me working with customers, say in sales, for example, that type of masking, or just, like surface level, like more business oriented interactions, I'm great with. What I struggle with is more of the setting with social workers and things like that, where you have this really intricate social dance and hierarchy, and if you don't engage in the office small talk or the office gossip, you're ostracized. And that's the kind of stuff that I think dealing with that level of masking for me was just too much on a daily basis. Like, I just couldn't compute all the extra social steps that go into it. And then when you add sensory issues in the mix, it can be just so overwhelming. So I think that's, one big consequence of masking long term is burnout. And it's actually, I think, so much masking to the point to where it can lead to burnout is where a lot of late diagnosed autistic or ADHDers actually arrive before they seek out or are referred for a diagnosis. At least that's the case for me. It's like I just got to a point where I was like this mask that had been perfect my whole life was just failing me. And I'm not going to say perfect, because I definitely had issues, but I think until I hit like my early 20s, like it just, all the pressure just kind of hit me at once. And I think that when you are diagnosed, or you do learn that you are potentially or are autistic and or ADHD, when you start to learn ways to unmask it, it's a really complicated process. And for me, I think some of the masking that I do is so deeply embedded, I don't know that I can get rid of it. And there's, a quote like, unlearning something is actually harder than learning it. And it takes time. For me, what I've had to do is I've just looked at it very logically. Like, okay, what ways am I masking that I don't want to mask in? What's causing the most harm in my life? And so for me, like I'm done like masking with the sensory stuff. I no longer force myself to go to situations that I know are going to be sensory hell for me, essentially. And if I do want to go, I make sure that I have sensory aids, or I have someone there with me. And it's not always easy for me to say no in certain situations, but it's definitely worth it than just forcing myself and having the same outcome of being perpetually burnt out and things like that. So, my advice, if you're just starting to try to unmask a little bit, trying to figure out, where you do mask, I think just having some self-awareness with the whole thing and just being compassionate. Like, I think removing like the, making it a good or bad thing, like it is. It's something that we've all done out of survival. But it was really cathartic for me to think about the ways that I do mask and even the root causes of why I mask in particular ways. And I've slowly, since my diagnosis, I have been working to drop some of those masks. And it's a mostly freeing experience and a mostly exciting experience. And I feel like I'm actually in touch with like my inner child version of myself again. But there are some painful parts of it. You may lose some friends. You may have some family members that don't understand some of it initially. But, I think it's important to be patient with yourself and patient with other people within reason. Um, but I think that for me, the only way that I'm going to be able to live a happy and healthy, long life is if I don't force myself into constant masking, is if I, seek out people, places, things that allow me to actually unmask. And of course, that's easier said than done. But I do hope that, like, through increased awareness and things like that, we can eventually like create a world where it's not forced upon us as much. So I'd love to hear your all's experiences about, masking, camouflaging, stuff like that in the comments. What do you feel like are the main ways that you do it? Do you think you do it at all? And what ways do you think it's helped you and or harmed you? So thanks, guys.